Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I think, given the debate that's happened in the House today, an appropriate title for this bill might be the Marine Legislation Just When You Thought It Couldn't Get Any Worse Amendment Bill. Because when the Exclusive Economic Zone legislation, which this bill amends, was passed through Parliament, Labor was the only party that voted against it at every single reading, and then at Select Committee other political parties realised just how dire the legislation was, that it was likely to be inconsistent with our commitments under the United Nations Conventions on the Law of the Sea, that it was woefully inadequate in terms of economic protection compared to the RMA, which is the legislation that governs economic activity in our territorial waters, that we were removing the ability to appeal to the Environment Court on points of substance, and that basically it was a general greasing of the wheels for industry to make sure that projects that potentially wouldn't have got through under the RMA process, which is far more robust, would get through under this very, very permissive piece of legislation. And when you consider that the line between our territorial waters and our exclusive economic zone is jurisdictional only, it's not based on the environment, any environmental factors, any scientific analysis, any risk factors, it's just that within 12 nautical miles is our territorial waters and beyond it isn't, you would have to question the sanity of having two such completely different regimes regulating exactly the same activity, operating side by side, separated only by an invisible jurisdictional line in the ocean. Well, the Labor Party thinks that that is not sensible. We don't see the sense in introducing untested legal terms in the exclusive economic zone. We question why we couldn't have used the well-known language of the Resource Management Act, which has 20 years of case law behind it, which provides certainty for regional councils, certainty for industry, certainty for communities that they know what they're dealing with, they know what these legal and environmental tests are. We said, why can we not just use those terms, mirror them in the exclusive economic zone legislation? And the answer is because, again, it was intended to be more permissive than the RMA, not to mirror the RMA. So Labor raised concerns the entire way through the process. We were very disappointed. We made approaches to Minister Adams saying to her, look, no one in the country, whether they be from industry or environmental NGOs, want to see this kind of pendulum swinging of legislation between national and Labor governments. We've seen it too often on crucial pieces of economic legislation like the Emissions Trading Scheme, like the Crown Minerals Act. How about we find, and it wasn't just Labor, it was a meeting that we had with the Greens, with New Zealand First, where we said, look, we actually think that there's a lot we could lock down in common on this exclusive economic zone legislation. How about we try and do it, find something that none of us are entirely happy with, none of us are 100% happy with, but we can all live with, and give that kind of assurance, that stability, that it's not going to change, and we were rebuffed. And that, I think, was very unfortunate. But the reason I think this could be called the Marine Legislation Just When You Think It Couldn't Get Any Worse Amendment Bill is because at that time we really did think, well, this is pretty bad, we're going to have to make changes to it. We've signalled clearly what those changes are going to be. No one saw this coming down the pipeline. We were not told at Select Committee. In fact, at Select Committee, it was reinforced for us time and time again that all these concerns that have been raised about the legislation, all the concerns that were raised in submissions, all the concerns that were being raised by councils, that were being raised by environmental NGOs, that were being raised by technical experts, that were being raised by the general public, would be addressed through the marine consent process, which allowed for public submissions. That's what we were told. Minister Phil Heatley, the then Minister of Energy, in Kaikoura, where there was significant public concern about the block offer that was being pursued off the coast, given their extensive whale watching interests, given how important that particular industry is to the economy in Kaikoura, asked Minister Heatley why this legislation was so weak, and he said to them, you will get to have your say through a public submission process when the application for a marine consent off the coast of Kaikoura is being considered. That was the promise the Minister of Energy made less than a year ago to the people of Kaikoura and then to the people of New Zealand. Well, I don't know whether he didn't read it properly, or whether he was lying, or whether he wasn't.
Can't say that.
Sorry, Mr. Chair. Whether he was being, yes, whether he was wrong, whether he was being, Mr Chair.
Moana Maki.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Whether he knew he was being misleading at the time, or whether in fact someone has got in the ear of the new Minister of Energy and the Minister of the Environment since that legislation has been passed and said, you know, that pesky process where we actually have to listen to people who have concerns, who want to have their say, or to experts who haven't been engaged in the process so far, who think that maybe when we're considering an application for an activity as controversial as offshore oil and gas exploration, that maybe we shouldn't solely rely on industry data, maybe we shouldn't solely rely on industry research, that maybe it's good to have a contestable process where people can challenge the science, where people can challenge the data, challenge the facts that have been put through by the applicant. Maybe that might make for a better process that, number one, could result in decisions being made based on all the information available, not just the information from one side, particularly when you consider that the Environmental Protection Authority doesn't have an investigative capability in there, that they're very new in what they do, and also the fact that when the Environmental Protection Authority legislation was going through this Parliament, Labor put up an amendment to make environmental protection one of the purposes of the Environmental Protection Authority, and the national government voted it down, which leads us to have some concerns about whether the EPA is actually about environmental protection or is in fact solely about economic development at any cost. So, Mr Chair, on this side of the House, we see the value in a submission process. I don't think there's a member of this House who sat on a select committee who doesn't see the value in that process, who accepts that even in an organisation like the EPA, you're not going to have a monopoly on all knowledge. There are going to be factors that could be brought through a submission process. That's why very few pieces of legislation go to a select committee in this House and come back to Parliament unchanged. It's because we take on board the points that have been made, the comments that have been made, and the same is true of a process which consents a very technical and controversial activity like offshore oil and gas exploration. And so to have that taken away not only undermines confidence in the legislation, not only undermines confidence in the government, not only undermines confidence in the process, but means that that information that would have been put on the table in front of an agency that is brand new, in front of an agency that doesn't have any investigative capability of their own, is now no longer going to happen. And the Minister, Amy Adams, said, oh, well, that's because we write legislation assuming that nothing's going to go wrong. Well, I'm sorry, but I don't know whether the Gulf of Mexico disaster just happened to other people and not to Minister Amy Adams, but it did, because things do go wrong. And legislation that consents risky activities, and even though the risks may be considered low, in exploratory drilling of exploratory wells, we cannot get past the fact that the Gulf of Mexico Deepwater Horizon disaster was in an exploratory well, was in a well that Minister Adams has said, well, they shouldn't have to go through a full consent process because the risk is so low, and I write legislation for things always going right, not for things going wrong. That is not good enough. And the National Party appears to be the only political party who hasn't taken another look at their policy in the wake of the Gulf of Mexico disaster, in the wake of the Rena disaster, in the wake of the Pike River disaster. They haven't done anything to reinforce our emergency response capability. My colleague Andrew Little has been doing a lot of work on what a rapid response capability would look like. Maybe based somewhere like Taranaki where they have a lot of experience in this. Maybe actually having some equipment in New Zealand ready to go in case something goes wrong. Having the expertise, training people on a regular basis. Surely these are lessons that we should have learned from tragic recent experiences which have had enormous environmental and economic impacts. But it appears that the National Party haven't learned. And the reason that they refuse to do anything, that they want to keep their heads buried in the sands, is because they have no plan B. Oil and gas exploration is their entire regional economic plan, and if it doesn't pan out, then they're kind of screwed. And we in the provinces are kind of screwed. And I'm sorry, but I think the provinces of New Zealand deserve a plan B from this government. If they want to charge ahead with oil and gas exploration, that's their right as a government. If they want to weaken environmental protections, they will be held to account for that at the next election. But we deserve a plan B in provincial New Zealand. Because if this doesn't pan out, and it hasn't, we've been told on the East Coast, come to Hamilton, says Mr Bennett, okay, That's Plan C. Plan C, my colleague says, is move to Hamilton. But we think, Mr Chair, we deserve a Plan B.
Yes, Stephen Browning.